The freelancer economy was already a major part of economic growth before the pandemic. Yeah, it's gone wild since. We'll talk about that today on Culture Builder Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. This is Culture Builder Live, talking about building better companies. One segment of how company growth, particularly in tech economies, have grown in the last 2 decades has been in part with the support of consultants, contractors, freelancers. How much that freelancer economy was part of a tech economy was always part of the conversation. Turns out it's grown quite a bit during this pandemic era. To talk about that, I have Margaret Lilani. She's the VP of Talent Solutions from Upwork, which has dropped a big report just recent weeks on the freelancer economy. Margaret, thanks for being here.
Chris, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'd love to have you. So set me up. The big sell out of this report from Upwork in December. Why now? What's the big trend that you're seeing in that research and study?
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the biggest things we've seen in our freelance forward study from 2022 is that the proportion of freelancers hit an all-time high at 39% of the US workforce. That's up
Mm.
from 36% in 2021. That means that more and more people are finding their careers as freelancers today.
And that, just so I clarify on that number, that 39% number, that includes both folks who are doing this full-time gigging and folks who would have freelance work in addition to a full-time role. That's true?
It is. And the interesting thing there is what we saw in the study from 2022 is roughly a third of those people are making their full career as freelancers. That is up from about a quarter of that population in 2020. So overall, not just an increase in the proportion of the U.S. workforce, but an overall increase of those folks who are doing it full time.
So that's a real standout to me here in our reporting. So percentage of folks who are doing some freelance work, either full-time or as a side gig, grew. The number of people doing it full-time grew a bunch, a quarter of that group to a third. That's a headline worth talking about. So let's do that. One big narrative in freelancers, like, look, there's a lot of language that's messy here, and a lot of them don't have technical definitions. They have cultural definitions. Contractor, consultant, freelancer, side gig, side hustle. These are terms that have slightly different meanings. Upwork's focus was in large part the knowledge work side of this, because obviously the contractor side, the 1099 economy side, for years that has referred to and at least talked about folks in the lower wage side being squeezed out of economy. What your study showed, you were also seeing some of the high wage end of contractors in the freelancer sense exploding. Is that fair? Talk to me a little bit about like the wage disparity and who you're seeing really surge in the freelancer economy.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, at Upwork, we work closely with a large marketplace of remote knowledge workers. And so those are going to be folks who are experts in their field and have chosen as a career to go forward and be independent and take their skills to businesses of all sizes. And so, really excited to see some of that trend progressing in the findings of our Freelance Forward study.
Can we talk a touch about the demographics you're seeing? This is where I think the gig working creative narrative, we've reported on those stories. We're doing a big series and interested in those folks. Is that gig working creative? I'm piecing together work so I can pursue my art. Is that pure cliche? Is that part of this trend? Are they a major part of the freelancer economy? How do you picture that kind of persona in this study's work?
Yeah, definitely. And so what I think is really interesting and important to talk about here is the generational component. So in
Mm.
any generation, I mean, you go back, you talk to our parents, there's always going to be the person who's piecing it together until they get their thing going. That's really not what we're seeing here. Especially for Gen Z and for folks who are just entering the workforce today, this is the first generation that has had a portion of their education be fully remote. And that's monumental. The pandemic changed a lot of things in a lot of places, but people who are entering the workforce now had a portion of their education be remote. And so this is natural to them. This is not foreign to them the way it might have been to somebody who, is a millennial or a Gen X or a boomer. And so they're really seeing freelancing and independent knowledge work as a real career path in a way that wasn't necessarily possible for prior generations.
The you play out maybe the generational divide a bit too, because I know one genuine concern we have is labor force participation. Numbers actually just in the last couple of weeks are telling a story that we are grabbing some more folks into labor participation. But one part of that story is a giant generation of boomers. There was this fear at one point of, well, what if they all retire en masse? And part of the pandemic story was we were worried about that. How much were on the older side of the demographics playing a part of the freelancer economy?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, if you think about what drives anyone, and then you focus that in on the boomer generation, people want to continue to add value. People want to keep their skills sharp. They want to keep learning. And, at their core, they need to make sure that they have the income so that they can, survive and thrive. And so when we look to the boomers, these are people who have been in the workforce for 20, 30, 40 years, and they have a lot to add. They don't necessarily just need to retire and go sit there. There's so much that they can contribute. And so it's really exciting to see them be able to continue their careers in a way that gives them flexibility and control, that allows them to work remotely and manage whatever they need to manage, spend time with their families, but be able to keep those skills sharp, keep their income going, and really keep adding value.
I'd love, this might be too narrow, but I'm just kind of curious about these persona, or these stories we're telling ourselves about who makes up a freelancer gig economy. And like, yeah, the gig working creative is one of those tropes. Another one is definitely like the creator economy. I'm doing YouTube videos, or I'm driving TikTok. I'm just kind of curious, is that at all, do you think that's playing any part? I'm quite curious about how much creator economy is more window dressing or a true trend in how folks are beginning to piece together gig work.
So for the first time in this survey, we asked about the creator economy. So we don't have the historical data there, but what we did see is that 23% of freelancers are creating influencer style content. I mean, that's huge. It makes sense though, if you think about, I mean, the world is becoming more and more digital. Companies want to get their brands out there regardless of their size, and so demand for this skill has been increasing, and as a result, the freelance economy has answered to that demand.
Right. So let's turn with our last few minutes to the future. I imagine Upwork will continue to do this sort of thing. We technically have routinely referenced the perhaps counterintuitive reporting that by about the mid 90s, a major shift happened when the majority of Americans worked for companies that were 250 employees or more. And for a bunch of years, we've done that reporting on, despite the narrative, entrepreneurship rates were declining. The pandemic upended that. Entrepreneurship rates have boomed completely unexpectedly. But still, the majority of Americans work at large firms. There's a big trend. How do you think this plays out? Do you see this inevitable trend line of, as software makes it easier and easier to work individually, do we all end up being one person shops? Do you think organizations and companies like do something in the long term? I'm just kind of curious, what does the freelancer economy play out to over the course of the years to come?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we think about the role that freelancing plays and how organizations operate, we really look at this with a lot of our clients. What we have found is the companies that are doing this right, whether these are in good times or bad, are the ones that have a hybrid talent strategy. They're going to have full-time employees. They're going to have operational folks who make the company run, who manage teams, who drive strategy within the organization, who really, make things happen in that way. What's going to be missing for companies that are growing, and all companies want to grow, is the need for experts. Like, you're not going to have every skill set that you need in-house as a large organization, and you can either hire somebody as a 40-hour-a-week head to come in the door and add that skill, and they may be doing certain other things as well that's not necessarily going to maximize the value that you're getting from them in that skill. Or you can look to have a bench of experts who you can bring in as freelancers and deploy as needed. And so the companies that do this well and do this right are going to continue, or are going to accelerate. They're going to be able to navigate economic headwinds. They're going to navigate through concerns around fixed costs and all of those things. And be able to get through tough times. And they're going to be able to leverage a smaller fixed core while they're able to do great things with all of this expertise at, right at hand.
How are you guys advising your clients about making that decision when the freelancer support is the right move for that organization as opposed to hiring in-house? There's some classic stories of just core competency, but what rules of thumb are you giving your clients on that?
Well, I mean, rule number one is that organizations that don't have a blended talent strategy are going to fall behind. That's just plain and simple. And so, for any full-time headcount, we advise take a look. Do you really need a full-time person on this? Or is this something that you can break up into a couple of different areas and leverage independent experts? And in some cases, the answer might be, I need a full-time head, and that's totally fine. But we're really encouraging the companies that we work with to think bigger so that they can move faster.
On the high end of this, Ron, I'm pushing a little bit beyond here, but the rise also of fractional executive roles, particularly at the growth stage, early stage company or small side, fractional chief marketing officer, fractional CFO. That seems also like a very prototypical of who Upwork's talking about, higher end, higher wage earners, but they're distributing their work across many entities. Do you see that as like an economic success? Because it's what you're alluding to, of giving specialty and distributing it out. Is that something you expect to see more of?
We do, and it depends on the size and the stage of the organization. But some companies don't need a full-time CMO. Some companies at the stage where they are need a fractional CMO, and they can leverage the experience and the expertise of somebody who's coming in, who has found success in the past, but also has diversity of thought and experience by the work that they're doing with other companies at the same time. And so it is an incredibly interesting way for companies to grow their influence, and eventually they may graduate to needing a full time. But it's the right talent at the right time to get them to that next stage.
Well said. All right, I'm gonna let you go here in a sec. Just curious, you spent a lot of time on this report, done this work a ton. Any point from it that most interested you, most stood out to you that we didn't touch on? What should I have asked that I didn't, that you want folks to know about this report? We'll make sure to drop a link to the report, by the way, in the comments below. But what stood out to you that we haven't hit on?
Yeah, so I think to wrap it up, the last thing that we didn't hit on here is we talked about the fact that the overall proportion of the workforce that's freelancing is increasing. The overall proportion of that group that is freelancing full time is increasing. It follows logically that the perception of freelancing is also becoming far more positive. And so this is something that we anticipate will continue to accelerate, and really will become, a much more embedded part of the way that people work.
Love it. Margaret Lilani, VP of Talent Solutions at Upwork. We'll again drop links in both below the video and in the recap story, and technically to the Upwork annual kind of freelancing report. Margaret, thanks so much for your work.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, everyone. We'll see you next week from Coach Builder Live. Thanks.